Hello, welcome to Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I am Robert, the narrator, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Confessions. Well, for the last couple or 3 months, I have been Ronin. So, yes, I have been without the game for the last 2 or 3 months. As I mentioned in previous episodes, I have been working on my New Year's resolution to complete a role playing game that I've been working on for a while. I've stopped playing with a group of friends that I have played with pretty much on a regular basis for the last 20 to 25 years. And we are still friends, of course, but I had to step away from the group because of the lack of variety in genre and system and setting when I'm not running. We basically have two other DMs, regular DMs in our group, and both of them either only run one genre or only runs one system. So I've decided to step away. This seems like a great time to focus on getting my RPG out there. It has been 25 years. Every time someone brings a new system to our gaming table, generally what happens is it would either end because of scheduling conflicts or because the system would be nitpicked to death if it was something new and different that we're not used to, and then we would just go right back to either a fantasy RPG, normally D&D, or to hero system champions, and this cycle would continue. That would run its course. Someone would bring something to the table that was neither one of those games, and rinse repeat was the process. I have known this for a while. Yeah, for 20 to 25 years, that has been the cycle essentially. I knew a while back, but I guess the focus of this episode is, when do you really know it may be time to move on from your group? When have you gotten all of the signs? For me, I would say even after 20 or 25 years of going through the same cycle, I think Rune Slinger, maybe Ivan Mike addressed this as well. It gets to a point where someone is willing to settle because you don't want to put the work in to go out and find a new group of guys to play with. It's easier job to just settle instead of going out and trying to find an entirely new group to gel with, to fit in with. And I think that's what it was. But the first sign to me that the end was nigh was about 2 or 3 years ago, when I literally ran out of any RPGs in my collection that my group had not played, and shot down or nitpicked the mechanics or setting to death to the point where we didn't play the system anymore. Literally, I did not own a game that had not happened with. And I slowly got to the point 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when I decided I'm not going to buy any more role playing games, or I was going to pull back, because pretty much if it wasn't fantasy or Dungeons and Dragons in particular, or hero, the system was going to get shot down. And I'm not the type of person who buys role playing games and increase my collection so that I can read them. I very seldom do that. If I'm buying a game, it's because I want to play it. So I'm not really a collector, so to speak, of role-playing games. I have, in the recent years, I have dedicated myself to, I want to own my top 10 favorites of all time. I have decided that I definitely am going to go back and purchase the games that were most impactful for me, and I have been doing that, and that's going to pretty much be my collection, my top 10 favorites of all time, and I want to own all of those. But for the most part, I only buy a game if I'm interested in running it, or it really interests me, and I think that there's even a little bit of a chance that the guys will give it a try, even for a short period of time. So that happened 2 or 3 years ago, and now I literally don't have a game that the guys haven't shot down in my entire collection, and I don't want to buy any games because I know what the outcome is going to be. It took me 25 years to get to that point, but that was the first sign. Then last episode, I put a question out there for anyone who listened to last episode, and the question I put it out there so that I could get answers and kind of respond to it this episode. And essentially, what the question was is if I came to you and I said, "Hey, I want to run an RPG where the fighter types have maneuvers but not a lot of skills. The rogue types have skills but not a lot of maneuvers, and the magic users don't have a lot of either but can cast spells. What game would immediately pop into your mind?" And to a person, that description reminded them of a version of D&D. So the reason I asked that question is because it relates to the final sign that it was time for me to move on from my group. A year or so ago, a year and a half ago, I ran Numenera for my group. And if you're not familiar with Numenera, it is a sci-fi, post-apocalyptic RPG by a former Dungeons and Dragons game designer, Monty Cook. He worked on 3rd edition. He did a little bit of stuff for 5th edition. So he's a very well-known game designer. And the reason I say Numenera is semi-post-apocalyptic because it is a world after some form of apocalypse, but it really doesn't, the game doesn't focus on resource management or finding resources in the survival aspect, but you're in a world, you're living in the world amongst the ruins of a previous world. And like a lot of Dungeons and Dragons designers, Monty Cook uses a great deal of Dungeons and Dragons tropes in Numenera. I see this all the time when former D&D designers go out and do their own games. They stick to the tropes that you were familiar with from D&D. Numenera uses a D20. The fighter types in Numenera have maneuvers but not a lot of skills, just like you would find in a lot of Dungeons and Dragons games. The rogues have skills but not a lot of maneuvers, and the magic users cast spells. So this game is as D&D as you can get. It's basically Dungeons and Dragons with the serial numbers filed off, and also it's a science fiction setting, but because it's post-apocalyptic, characters get around kind of just like they do in a fantasy setting. They have to walk everywhere, or maybe they have riding animals, but they don't have vehicles, and they explore ruined areas just like Dungeons and Dragons. So Numenera is as D&D as you can get. I did play testing for the public play test for Numenera, and I really was drawn to it because of the setting, which I'm not going to get a whole bunch into. That's really beside the point for the reason I'm discussing it. But I didn't choose it because my group of friends really love fantasy and really love D&D. I chose it because I really like the setting. And I just thought it was an added benefit that the system was so similar to Dungeons and Dragons. I thought that was just, a bonus. But even this game that uses a d20 for resolution and is actually, the task resolution system is easier than a lot of the recent editions of Dungeons and Dragons, because you roll it in those editions of Dungeons and Dragons, the most recent, you roll a d20, you add a number to it. In Numenera, you can literally do task resolution by rolling a d20. You don't have anything to add to it, and you take your roll. So it's even easier than the most recent editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And my friends, one of the things that they like to complain is that the games that I like are convoluted. So the task resolution system was even easier than D&D. It had all of the tropes, and it still wasn't D&D enough for my group. They don't want anything that's like D&D. They just want D&D. So for me, that is when I knew it was over. When I no longer had anything in my collection that my group had not shot down, and was really not willing to put any more into systems that were going to get shot down anyway. And when I brought a game to the table, something that just happened to be very, very, very similar to what our guys continue to go back to, and it still wasn't enough. And that's when I determined that it was time to move on. I can't tell you where your individual breaking point is. You'll have to determine that for yourself. Everyone's tolerance is a little bit different, but I've given it 25 years. So I think that I have pretty much figured out what the tastes of my particular group are, and it's not going to change. And again, the reason it took so long to make this change is, one, you settle and you don't want to do the work of going out and acclimating yourself to another group. And two, the time that I'm not spending role playing, I can spend developing my game. So there's never really something like that I have kind of committed to, which makes this additional free time really great to have. That is the story of how I determined that the end was near with my current gaming group. The second part of this episode, I want to discuss an aspect of my game that's a fairly universal concept that I think everyone can be interested in. So, working on my game, again, of course, as I've mentioned 1,000 times, and working on some mechanics. And these mechanics tend to give me the feeling that they are fairly useless. I have never really seen these mechanics used in an interesting fashion, and they always seem to be there for no reason. Can you figure out what mechanic I'm speaking of? I'm talking about languages. So yeah, I was working through my game, working on languages, and it occurred to me that in my 25 years of gaming, I've never seen languages be really interesting or matter in the game or anything like that. So I've always wanted to come up with a way to make languages interesting. I was watching a video of another fellow vlogger, and I apologize that I can't remember the name of the vlogger, and something that he mentioned was everyone should have trade speak, and if the PCs can only communicate with an NPC using trade speak, then they really can't get across any ideas more complex than give me that item and I'm going to pay this for it, which makes languages interesting. If you don't have the right language, you can't get the information you want. But on the other hand, if the PCs are gathering information, and let's say they make their gather information roll, the fact that they may not be able to speak to an NPC makes it kind of a headache. And that's generally what the language mechanic always has seemed to me. It's on the verge of being very interesting and something that you want to or at least I want to matter in my game. But the only way it tends to matter is if it's slowing things down, which is, never good. So this is not really a trick or a tip, but I'm just throwing it out there. Has anyone seen a good use of a language mechanic in a game, something that didn't slow the game down and become a headache? And if so, please let me know what that was. Everyone has cell phones, and if the PCs came across an NPC and now a very small minority of the party can speak the language, what I've always wanted to do is to send text messages between me and the PC who can speak the language, so that the PC has to role play and explain what's being said. But that kind of slows things down. And if you don't have everybody who's on board with staying immersed, texting the brief conversation to the PC and forcing him to role play everything, you have players who aren't really that much into immersion. It could not go over well. So that's one thing I've always wanted to do. But I don't know. The language mechanic has its usefulness, and the richness that it can bring to the game has always escaped me. And I think a great part of it is you have to have players who want that level of immersion for it to matter. And yeah, I just want to throw it out there to you. What great ideas do you have for a language mechanic? Have you ever seen interesting uses? How would you feel if every once in a while, when a very small minority of the party can speak a particular language and they're interacting with an NPC, what would you think if the game master decided to text between the NPC and the player that can understand the language, so that you can be immersed and the player can role play and kind of interpret for the other PCs what's going on in the game? Because I'm stuck. I have a good number of languages, and like every other game I've played, I really can't think of a really good use for it that just doesn't slow the game down. So that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. Talk to you next time, and good morning or good evening wherever you are. Thanks a lot.